We're here with John Stanton, the chairman of the Seattle Mariners Major League Baseball organization. John, welcome to Alaska Beyond.
Thank you, Swanee.
So nice to have you here. Before we get started, or as we get started, I'd like to talk to you about the excellent relationship that Alaska Airlines has with the Seattle Mariners. We are the sponsor of the Seattle Mariners broadcast on the Seattle Mariners radio network, which is heard in 3 states. If I'm correct, Oregon, Idaho, Alaska, make that 4 states, and Washington.
Right. Our broadcast area includes actually parts of Canada, parts of British Columbia. We share that with the Toronto Blue Jays, and we don't broadcast there today, but our territory actually shares the Hawaiian market. So we've got by far the largest broadcast network geographically in all of baseball.
Well, geographic distance is a big issue with the Seattle Mariners because you travel further than any other Major League Baseball team for your away games.
Right. It's the perfect complementary relationship with Alaska. The one stat that we have led the league in almost, I believe, every of our 42 years is number of miles traveled. We will travel about 57,000 miles as a team this year, simply because of the geography. It's an important part of who we are, is to figure out a good way to travel. The relationship with Alaska is a natural.
Well, that's so cool. I always joke with my family on the East Coast when we talk about living in Seattle in the Pacific Northwest, they kind of view this as the colonies. So are there any steps you take to help your players and staff adjust to the rigors of the long distance travel that you do?
Well, just like our individual health is affected by diet, exercise, and sleep, we try to do everything we can to help our players get a good diet, exercise well. That's kind of the easy part with them. And then sleep. And the sleep patterns for us sometimes involve taking flights earlier, taking flights later, making sure that we maximize their opportunity to get a good night's sleep. We'll often send the starting pitcher in a series ahead a day so that pitcher can get a good night rest. If we're playing a late game on a Sunday and we've got to play an early game or even a afternoon game on the Monday, we'll send that pitcher ahead a day so that he'll get a good night's sleep.
I had no idea you did that. There's a lot of little pieces like that to go into making sure that the Mariners are competitive in the game.
Absolutely.
Talking more about the relationship between the Seattle Mariners and Alaska Airlines, there's a couple other pieces to that. Alaska Airlines is the title sponsor to the Mariners post-game broadcast, both on radio and television.
It's a terrific relationship, and it's shot right here in the ballpark, usually out in center field. We've got a couple of guys that consistently do that. They talk about the game. It's a great show.
Do you ever appear on that show?
Usually that's just the talking heads. I've been on the pregame show, and during the game broadcasts quite a bit. The postgame show really is an opportunity for them to replay footage, to talk about what's happened in the game, identify the key players and key highlights.
Alaska is also the presenting sponsor of the Where I Root feature on Twitter.
That's great.
And that is so cool. My favorite part of that is looking at the fans from all over the world who root for the Seattle Mariners. And one piece of that's my ultimate favorite part, is our servicemen and women overseas checking in from Afghanistan, Iraq, and the Middle East and Korea, showing that they're rooting for the Seattle Mariners.
Absolutely. Well, we have fun with it. Last year I was out in center field, and I had to help a gentleman who I'm not sure he had ever sent a text before, much less gone on social media, but he wanted to get a picture of him and his grandson on the big screen. So I helped him figure out where I root, and we eventually made sure that he was on the screen. I helped a little bit on that one.
Well, that's a memory they'll never forget.
Alaska's been an important partner for the Seattle Mariners really almost the entire history of this ballpark, almost 20 years, and in that relationship we do a variety of things. Alaska has named an airplane in honor of the Mariners. Last year we had a number of the MVP Gold members to a reception out in left field, and had a lot of fun with honoring those folks and making sure they feel like they're special customers of Alaska and special fans of the Seattle Mariners.
It is such a great relationship. Almost 20 years and still rolling. How cool is that?
Absolutely.
Now we've talked about that a little bit. I'd like to talk about you as a person, learn your history.
Terrific.
So you're from the Pacific Northwest. Can you tell us about your growing up years and your family of origin?
Sure. I was born in Seattle. My parents moved to Bellevue in 1959 when I was 4 years old, and I went all the way through the Bellevue Public Schools. I'm a proud Newport Knight graduate, and my mom still lives in Bellevue. I still live on the east side, and it's an important part of why I love the Seattle Mariners.
So at Newport High School, who was your most influential teacher?
You know, it's funny. I think my favorite teacher and person probably influenced most where I ended up going in the next stage of my life was my history teacher. We called it social studies back then, Jim Lockerbie. Jim was an inspiring guy. He traveled during the summers, and talked about different cultures. He talked about, government and the way government worked, and I just thought he did a great job. I hadn't seen him in probably 30 years. It turns out he's a Mariners fan.
Excellent.
We have a group that meets almost monthly, I guess, here on Fridays, called the RBI Club, and they'll have speakers come in. Last week they had a couple of local umpires come in and talk to them, and I'm at an RBI Club event, talking to various folks, and a guy comes up to me and asks me a question, and he was familiar, but I didn't really recognize him. And I looked down at his name tag, and his name was Jim Lockerbie. And I said, "Are you the Jim Lockerbie?" And he had this big smile, just like he did in high school, and it was the Jim Lockerbie from Newport High School.
Had he been following your career progression?
We didn't talk. We talked about the Mariners.
Okay.
We didn't particularly talk about that, but he inspired me and an awful lot of young people over a lot of years. And the funny thing for me is, I didn't know he was a baseball fan when I was a student.
Well, they don't tell you that much, teachers, when you're in their class. They just want you to learn the subject.
Right.
But an inspirational guy. That's so cool. So you went on to college at Whitman College in Walla Walla, which is in a beautiful part of Washington State, the southeastern corner, do I have it correct? Yeah. A lot of wineries there. What was that like?
Well, Walla Walla today is a lot different than the Walla Walla that I went to college at 40 years ago. Walla Walla was a small farming town. Whitman was a school of about 1,000 people. It had an enormous positive impact on my life. Whitman's a liberal arts college, and you go as a young person. It opened my mind. It opens the minds of a lot of the students that go there. Great experience. The funny thing to me is that Walla Walla now has an easy time attracting people. I think there are a lot of people who fly on Alaska over to Walla Walla because of the wineries. There were no wineries in 1977 when I graduated. The first one actually started producing wine a year or two later. Leonetti, Woodward Canyon, LaCole, some great wineries, but they've all grown up in the last 40 years. Now I think they've got over 200 wineries in the Walla Walla Valley, and I don't know if they have a lot of traffic, but it's a whole lot busier than it was when I was a student.
What was your hardest subject in college?
Well, let's put it this way. I took a lot of political science, economics, and history. I didn't spend a lot of time in the science building or in math. And the classes I took were, for me at least, pretty easy because the subjects were fun.
You enjoyed it. You had interest in it.
I loved it.
And it's much easier to stay focused on something
Absolutely.
when you have that interest.
Absolutely.
When you were attending Whitman College, did you have any idea that sometime in the future there'd be a building named after you on the campus?
No, they did that last year. That was a great honor. Whitman's meant a lot to me. I've stayed involved in the college. I was on the board for 23 years. I led our fundraising campaign, and I was proud that my younger son decided to go there, and he's went in a program that he went there 3 years and then to another school back east for a couple of years in math and computer science. So he worked in the opposite part of campus than I spent time in.
He's on the technical side.
He was. I'm not sure. Those genes must come from his mother.
Oh, funny. What was your first job out of college?
Well, straight out of college, I actually went to grad school.
Oh, you went to...
I worked all through that time, and when I was in grad school, I worked in and then later ran a bar and restaurant that was actually in the dorms. It was called the Pub and Galley in Gallatin Hall.
And was that at Harvard?
Yeah. And I got up early and served breakfast, and then I attended bar at night. So
and went to the school in between.
And went to school in between.
Now, turning to your days at Harvard Business School, what was the most challenging part of that?
Frankly, the most challenging part is that I had to work and be in school at the same time. It was challenging. My dad had gotten sick, so I was paying for everything myself, and it was expensive and required a lot of juggling, I'll say. For me, though, I had a degree in political science. Nothing I did in my undergraduate prepared me for the kinds of questions that would be asked even the first day of business school. What is a contribution margin? I never took an accounting class. Whitman didn't offer accounting when I was there, so I really didn't know. But what Whitman taught me was how to think, and ultimately what business school tries to test is how well you think. The fact set, the information, the data, entirely different between political science and marketing or production or accounting. But I got more confident, particularly in my second year, that while the information may be new, the kinds of thinking, the kinds of analysis that you had to do were fairly straightforward.
And the study habits and study structure were probably very similar.
Right. Well, I think it's true in almost anything. If you work hard, you can make progress, you can do things that you need to do, and frankly, that's the philosophy that I've taken with everything I've ever taken on.
What time management lessons did you get from that experience of working a job in the morning, going to school in the middle of the day, and then working in the evening? There had to be some secret sauce that you used to develop that.
Well, first of all, sleep was never a priority when I was in grad school. For me, they were just very long days. You find every opportunity you can. If I was tending bar at night and I had a slow time, I'd just have the case study that I was prepping for the next day behind the bar, and I'd read it and I'd spend time on it. You have to be very disciplined and say, okay, I'm going to spend 1 hour on this and an hour on that. One of the great things that professors used to terrify you at business school was to call on you. Every class session involved somebody being, the phrase we used to use is cold called, so that you'd have 70 or 80 students in a class, and the professor would look down on a list and say, Swanee, could you start us off today? And you had to have a 3 to 5 minute set of comments about the case to begin. So if the night before, working in the bar, I didn't spend an hour on the marketing class, it was almost inevitable that's the class that I would be called on to start.
Exactly. Of course that's the one that would happen at. I had a similar experience in Air Force pilot training. They would call on us, and I used to game the system a little bit. When I really knew the answer and everything, I'd kind of shrink and act like I was scared, and then they'd call on me. And when I really didn't know the answer, I'd kind of look at the professor going,
I should have had you coach me up. I didn't. I tried to prepare for everything rather than
Yeah.
take the random risk that I might be unprepared on that one
Yeah,
day.
I think you were a little more disciplined at that stage in life than I was, and I was gradually coming up to speed. How did you enjoy living on the East Coast?
I enjoyed it. You know, I'm a Northwest guy.
Yeah.
I've spent almost my entire life back here. I've had the good fortune to be able to travel a lot. I spent a tremendous amount of time in New York, Washington. You know, the years I was in Boston when I was in school, and I love it back there, but I always come home. It's, I've never had a desire to live anywhere else, and I've never really pursued anything that would have caused me to live anywhere else because I love it so much.
I used to fly a lot between Seattle and Boston, and I always felt that Boston felt a lot like Seattle to me. Is that accurate? Do you think that's the case?
I think there's certainly a lot in common. You know, the folks in Boston, you know, the cultures have similar heritage, you know, kind of a seafaring town originally. I think there's an independent streak, a confidence. I also think there's a friendliness, kind of a Northwest nice. You know, people in Boston, you know, that I'm still friends with, you know, are welcoming, and sometimes that reputation doesn't necessarily extend further south when you get to New York.
What was your first job out of college, out of grad school?
I got out of school in 1979, and the economy in the Northwest was horrible. It was a really tough time to be getting a job. Interest rates were very high. Unemployment was well over 10%. Northwest had one of the weaker economies in the country. So I was anxious. My father had died by that time. I wanted to be back here because of my mom. And so I was determined to get a job in the Northwest. I interviewed with a number of companies, and the one I ended up with was with a consulting practice in telecommunications. It was owned by the accounting firm Ernst & Ernst, but we had 60 people that just worked on issues in telecommunications. And I ended up having several different alternatives, but that was the one that I thought represented the best opportunity in the long run to get involved in an industry that I thought, and as it turned out, was going to change radically.
And I was going to ask you, you just answered the question I was going to ask you, and that was, what was the first idea or event that triggered your movement into the telecom industry?
Well, I was talking, actually there was a friend of mine from business school who had the advice to me. He said, think about an industry that represents an opportunity in the future, kind of the notion of skating to where the puck will be in hockey rather than skating to where the puck is. And you know, he said telecommunications was going to go through a lot of change, and I didn't know that. This was in the winter of '78, '79, and I started doing some research and found out that he was absolutely right. That because of a lot of government efforts as well as the courts, there was going to be change in telecom, and it wasn't clear what that change would be, but it's clear that it was going to happen. When young people ask me my advice on what to go into, I discourage them from going into an industry that is already well established. I encourage them to look for things that represent opportunities in 5 or 10 years from now and get in on the ground floor. That's exciting. If you see an industry where there is change going on or where there are competitive opportunities, that tends to be a better opportunity for a young person to get in and make a difference.
So following that strategy and that idea that you're sharing with us now, you wound up being one of the pioneers in wireless communications.
In the fall of 1979, the Federal Communications Commission that governs, regulates the telecom industry decided that they wanted to create a cellular telephone business. And No one else in my office was very interested in the topic, and I really thought it might be interesting. So I started doing my research, and at 24 years old, declared myself to be an expert in cellular telephones. Fact is that there weren't any, so it was possible at that age to at least have some level of expertise. And I did what you do in a consulting practice. I tried to become an expert in something, and then I tried to sell business. And the fun thing for me was that I was able to find some small telephone companies interested in getting into the business that I helped initially. And then in 1981, I heard from a friend in Washington, D.C. about a local Bellevue company that was in the cable television business that was interested in getting into cellular telephony. And that led me to meet Craig McCaw and his team at McCaw Communications. McCaw was a cable company at that stage, but Craig had the vision, he had the idea of getting into the wireless phone business. And I was able to help him with his applications. A lot of the early work was done by consultants, and they basically said, well, we're going to fire all our consultants. Do you want to come on board? And I said, well, it sounds like a pretty good opportunity to me. And so I came on board, and my first job was to fire all of the consultants, including my old firm, and hire people to get the work done.
How did that go over?
Yeah, I still have a lot of friends there.
Okay.
1982 was the earliest phase that the FCC allocated spectrum in a band to create what we called cellular telephone companies. They said the telephone company would be one franchise. Here that was originally US West. And then government accepted applications to compete to get the second license. That's what we did at McCaw. And we created the brand name Cellular One. We got the licenses both in here and in Portland. And we became the first operator to be able to provide competitive service in both of the markets. Great opportunity. I spent the next 35 years in the wireless business, mostly in the United States, but also outside the U.S. In 1987, my wife and I started working on another alternative service. The FCC was beginning to look at the possibility of creating more competition in the industry. That led us to create a rural company called Western Wireless. That company then birthed a company called VoiceStream, which was later sold to Deutsche Telekom to create T-Mobile. And then actually, after I thought I was completely retired in about 2000 from telecom in 2008, my old friend Craig McCaw called and asked if I would be on the board of this company Clearwire that he was getting going. Right. And I did, and eventually he asked me to be the chairman, and for a short period of time I was the CEO of that. So from 1982 until that company was sold in 2013, I was pretty much in the wireless business most of the time.
Going back to your statement about skating to where the puck is going to be instead of skating to the puck, did you have any idea how big wireless would become at the time?
No, I mean, the amazing thing, I remember, if I go back to this original research I did back in ¡79, I found a study that AT&T, the old AT&T back then had done, and they suggested that by the year 2000 there would be 1 million wireless phone customers, phones in the US. They were only off by 2 digits. It was 100 million. But we thought they knew more than anyone else, so we kind of assumed that they were right.
They had the most experience in communications.
Absolutely. Yeah. They had a monopoly in large parts of the communications business at the time. We thought it might be a little bit better. Some of our early models suggested that the market might be 25 million by 2000, but we had no idea that, eventually, as is the case today, there are more wireless devices than there are people in the United States.
So the puck turned out to be much bigger than you thought it would be.
It did. Wireless was one of the great opportunities of our generation, and certainly I saw an opportunity for myself. I had no idea that it would be as big as it is.
Going back to when you were growing up, I read about a traumatic episode in your life, and that was the loss of the Seattle Pilots Major League Baseball team. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I have to confess, I probably wouldn't call it as a traumatic event. It was a great disappointment that I had. I was always a baseball fan. I loved playing baseball. Frankly, I wasn't very good. And 1969, when I was 14 years old, was the year that I basically was told that I should pursue other alternatives rather than try to pursue my career as a Major League Baseball player. So I think my baseball coach encouraged me to go into debate, which I did. But the opportunity for me was that we had a baseball team here. It was called the Seattle Pilots. It was exciting. You know, we're actually writing a history of the Seattle Mariners, and I know a lot more about how it came to be. But the point is, summer of '69 was great. You know, we played in Sixth Stadium, which is down the Rainier Valley, and just a spectacular venue. And the irony is that the ballpark was too small for a Major League team. That was one of the issues that Major League Baseball had. But as a fan, it was a very intimate experience. It was terrific, and I have a lot of great memories of going to games with my dad that summer. That team then, you know, everyone leaves at the end of the season. They're getting back together for spring training. Spring training for that team was down in Arizona, and a gentleman from Milwaukee, which had lost their Braves team a couple years before, connects with the owners of the Seattle Pilots team. They had lost a lot. The owners had lost a lot of money, and frankly didn't have a lot of money. And he bought that team. And that fellow from Milwaukee was Bud Selig, who later became the commissioner of baseball. But literally, they loaded all the gear on the buses, and they were intending originally to go to Seattle. Those buses turned east and went to Milwaukee, and that team has been the Milwaukee Brewers ever since. And as I've said a couple of times, I cried when that happened. I loved going to those games, and I was deeply disappointed, and it did have an impact on me.
And going back to a common theme in this interview, when you were crying about the loss of a Major League Baseball team in Seattle, it never occurred to you that you'd be the chairman of a Major League Baseball team in Seattle in 2019.
No, and you know, Craig McCaw used to joke that strategy sometimes is just putting one foot in front of the other and seeing where it leads you. I have been fortunate to be partners with a number of terrific people. The opportunity when Nintendo decided to sell their controlling interest of our partnership, but remain a partner in the Mariners franchise. My partners asked me to be the chairman, and we led the process of buying out the bulk of Nintendo's interests and being involved. You know, I joke that I'm the kid who had baseball cards on the floor in his room all the time growing up, and now I get to walk out on a Major League Baseball field and talk to the players. I mean, it really is a kind of a pinch me moment.
It's a dream come true, isn't it?
Absolutely.
When did you get the first idea to become an investor in professional sports?
Well, it's funny, the first opportunity I had, I turned down. There was a crisis here. The owner at the time was a gentleman named Smulyan, and he had, like the original owners of the Pilots, he had some financial problems in his businesses. He needed to sell the team, and he put the team up for sale. And there was a lot of talk, and there was a group formed down in Tampa that was going to try to buy that team. In fact, we've got a T-shirt around here someplace that says Tampa Bay Mariners. The name actually kind of has a nice ring to it. And they were going to build a stadium. They were going to take the team. And Senator Slade Gorton, as he'd done a couple of times before, saved baseball in Seattle. Slade got on the phone and started calling business people in Seattle. Eventually found Nintendo, found Chris Larson, found a lot of my other partners. And one of those partners was John McCaw, in the original partnership, and he was trying to, among the Macaw executives, raise some money. And I thought about it, but my wife and I were just starting to invest heavily in our Western wireless and voice stream businesses, and the timing just wasn't right. We were literally, Terry and I were writing payroll checks for our, we had about 100 employees out of our own personal bank account at that stage. So, you know, the notion of putting money into a baseball team when there would likely be follow-on capital calls just wasn't good timing. And then ironically, about 8 years later, John, for a variety of reasons, decided to sell his interest. And so my wife and I were able to buy John's interest and become partners in 2000. So that was great timing for us. And I've been a minority partner since then. And then 2.5 years ago in 2016, when Nintendo decided to sell their interest, the opportunity arose for us, my wife and I, to invest a lot more and to, along with our partners, buy out most of the Nintendo interest.
The Nintendo interest in the team when they first bought in attracted a lot of attention in Japan. And as a result, the Mariners wound up with a huge following in Japan.
It did. Hiroshi Yamauchi was the founder of Nintendo, and he originally made a personal commitment simply because Seattle and the United States, but particularly Seattle, had been so good to Nintendo. He wanted to thank the people of Seattle by saving the baseball team. And he did that. A Japanese owner in Major League Baseball was controversial at the time, that there were a lot of Major League owners that believed that all teams should be owned locally and should be owned by Americans. And so that then prompted Slade Gorton to not only get Nintendo committed, but to find other owners, and you know, people like Chris Larson and John McCaw and Frank Schwantz, John Ellis, came together to really save the team. But you know, from our point of view, we have deep Japanese roots with likely two players, Kikuchi and Ichiro on our opening day roster. I believe that we will have had 21 consecutive years in which we will have a Japanese-born player on our roster. That's dramatically more than any other team in baseball. Our games are still watched in Japan. We're incredibly excited that we're going to open in Japan against the Oakland A's this year. We'll play 2 games that count towards our Major League schedule, as well as 2 exhibition games against Japanese teams over there.
John, what's your #1 goal for the 2019 baseball season for the Mariners?
Well, you know, I have a lot of goals. The most important on-field goal for us is to put an exciting team on the field. And we think that this team, which is a new, young team, is going to win a lot of games. We think they're going to have a lot of fun, and it's a very exciting brand. Frankly, a more exciting brand of Mariner baseball than you've seen in the past. We want to make sure that every fan that comes to T-Mobile Park has a great experience. You know, we in fact, we've learned from Alaska Airlines. You know, we've done surveys of our fans in the ballpark. We've done focus groups, and we've done some things in terms of innovating on food. We've got a deal of the day, so there's always a bargain here. We've got you can get a inexpensive beer in the ballpark now, which did not used to be the case. And then the last element from my perspective is we are an institution in this community, and we are also a citizen in this community, and we are involved in this community. This afternoon we're going to have 5 of our players doing a clinic for kids down in the Rainier Valley, not far from where the Seattle Pilots used to play. And you know, that's exciting. Tomorrow morning we're going to have a coaches clinic here at T-Mobile Park, where we'll have 80 to 100 youth coaches listening to Scott Service and talk about what it's like to, what's important about coaching. We believe that our involvement in the community is one of the 3 key things we do. We win baseball games, we provide great entertainment, and we serve this community.
John, thank you so much for joining us here on Alaska Beyond. It's a pleasure talking to you, and we wish you nothing but the best for the 2019 Mariners baseball season.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.